Thank you for tuning into the Devy Devotional Podcast, a monthly show focusing on Devy prospects, strategies, and incoming rookies. Now here's your host.
Welcome back to the Devy Devotional, where we stay devoted to Devy. I'm your host, Dynasty Coach A. As always, I'm joined by Aaron Wilcox at Aaron Wilcox86 on Twitter. But tonight we have a special guest. We are joined by at Analytics. And tonight we're going to be getting nerdy. We're going to talk about some of the most important metrics to know when it comes to Devy. We're going to teach Aaron all about our nerdy ways. Me and Nelly will. And then, we're going to dive into some players even where, the metrics say this player's going to be great, or maybe, the complete opposite there. And we even have a couple tweets to possibly argue about it maybe a little bit. So things might get a little heated a little bit later on. But like I said, we're joined tonight by Nelly. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to anyone that doesn't know who you are, and then we can bring on Aaron after that.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Nelly. You did as good of a job saying my Twitter handle as I think anyone ever has. I don't think I've even said it that way. I think I'm going to stick with that in the future, actually. Like you said, that's my Twitter handle. If you're listening, you've probably gotten into an argument with me on Twitter at one point as well. But thanks for having me. I'm excited for this.
Absolutely. I remember a Twitter argument that we started, and that actually turned into a podcast that we did. Do you remember who that podcast was about? It's kind of blanking right now.
Yeah. It was about Malik Willis. I was pro Malik Willis, and I'd like to say that my argument was fully based on the expected draft capital that he didn't get. So I'm copping out of that argument.
I love it. All right, Aaron, you've been waiting patiently. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing really well. I'm glad we're off to a hot start. Let's keep it going. I'm really excited to have you on, Nelly, and just learn from your guys' expertise. And I'm somebody who dabbles in a blend of approaches, so analytics, film-based analysis, trying to combine some of those. So, yeah, let's get to it. I'm looking forward to tonight.
Absolutely. Like we said, we're going to be talking nerdy, getting nerdy. And Nelly, what are some of the favorite metrics that you look at when it comes to Devy in particular? Because I don't know about you, but while my Devy and my NFL models might be similar, I definitely had to switch some things up because you're looking for kind of different things when you're trying to get these players that have maybe only played 4 games or whatever it might be, and are they going to be good in the future? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think a good place to start off is with wide receivers because they're the easiest to predict in terms of using certain metrics to predict how they'll project to the NFL. And the metric I particularly like is yards per team pass attempt, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's really just yards per pass is what I'd like to change it to, like change the nomenclature to yards per pass because that's just much more straightforward. And the way that I like to use it is I like to age adjust it for years of experience, right? So like the expectation as a freshman is different than an expectation as a senior for a wide receiver, for like sort of the baseline that you're looking for from them. So the reason why this metric is important, the reason why it's helpful is it really gives you a sense of how productive you are with relation to your team. But at the same time, you still have to be productive in order to succeed in it. So it's proven to be pretty sticky to the NFL, and it's my go-to metric for wide receivers.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, obviously, we've seen it all over Twitter. The only thing I don't really love is when people get caught up as the only thing that matters is yards per team pass attempt. It definitely is a very important stat or metric, and it stands out as one of the better ones. But I do think that you have to look at a multitude of metrics and not just one. And you can get caught up just saying, "Oh, this is the only thing that matters," like I said. So, is there anybody that's like truly standing out to you? You don't have to like do a long list or anything like that, but just like somebody that's really standing out with that one particular metric.
Sure. So I think one of the highest guys in college last year was Josh Downs from UNC. He was so good with relation to his team. And so he's someone who absolutely flashed with it, and he looked really good as a second year guy. Now, I will say he didn't do very much as a freshman, right? So his yards per team pass attempt as a freshman were not good, and that also matters. Like the way I like to use it is I like to like a cumulative above and below expectation from year to year. So it kind of puts their whole college career together.
Yeah, I love that. Aaron, do you have a lot of expertise or time spent with the yards per team pass attempt?
Yeah, so it is one of the two or three metrics that I like to look at. So that, and then maybe we'll get to, just receiving yards market share, overall market share. I've seen some people, and I've looked at reception market share as well. How many receptions versus yards. I've seen yards more commonly used. I don't know if either of you have a strong preference. And then also dominator rating, which accounts for touchdowns. But as we know, touchdowns aren't always sticky. So I guess there's pros and cons, and maybe you guys can speak to those. But yeah, I love yards per attempt. And I agree. Josh Downs really stuck out. Another guy, Jacob Cohen. A little bit lower level of competition, but he had an excellent year. Just if you're looking at that statistic in 2021.
Yeah, I love it, and you're absolutely right. There's definitely some others like receiving market share, things like that. But what I've found with you had asked about receptions versus yardage, and at least in the NFL part of the model. I've definitely found that the yardage is more important, but that doesn't mean that the receptions don't matter either. I think, once again, I really try not to use just one. And you don't want to have 42 metrics that you're using either, but I really do try to have a variety there. And so I like both, but if you forced me to pick one over the other, it would definitely be the yards. What do you think, Nelly?
Yeah, my go-to in terms of the market share ones is what we call weighted dominator, because as you mentioned, Aaron, dominator is flawed because touchdowns are as important as yards, and touchdowns aren't nearly as sticky, right? Like it's much more volatile and less predictive. So the way weighted dominator works is it's 80% yards market share, 20% touchdown market share. So it still accounts for the touchdowns without overweighting them, and I like that. And I like John. You make a great point. It's important not to use one. And the great thing about weighted dominator is it works well in tandem with yards per team pass attempt, because what weighted dominator will do sometimes is guys will stand out in weighted dominator and they won't stand out in yards per team pass attempt, and that kind of adds context to the situation they're in. Like people say all the time, like, oh, like these are numbers, where's the context? Well, this kind of gives the context. If you're one of those guys with a high weighted dominator and a low yards per team pass attempt, you were in a bad offense. So you were good for your offense, but you still weren't that productive as a whole. So a guy like Isaiah Nayer last year had a 53% weighted dominator, which is absurd, like unheard of. But his yards per team pass attempt was very good, but it wasn't nearly as absurd. And that's because he played for Wyoming, and Wyoming wasn't very good.
But he scored a ridiculous amount of touchdowns for them, and it really didn't make sense with the yardage they had, the amount of touchdowns that he scored. And so, like you said, it's not necessarily sticky. That's why we're trying to pick out the metrics that are. You don't want to just stick to one thing. And and touchdowns is definitely not one that you really want to focus on. Don't get me wrong, we love some touchdowns. One of the metrics that I do use in the model is PPR points per touch. And obviously that's going to use touchdowns. Like touchdowns are going to be a part of that. And I think I'd much rather use something like that than focus too much on the touchdowns per se. It's just what did you do in that offense? How many PPR points were you able to score? And especially when you're breaking it down per touch, you really kind of find out who that player is. Are they explosive? Are they are they going to be a big play receiver, or are they going to be a slot that's getting you 8 yards per reception, like that kind of thing. And so while it might not be nearly as important as like market share and yards per team pass attempt and things like that, I definitely do like looking at the PPR touch per attempt, because once again, players like a Jacob Cohen and who else, like a Quentin Johnston, like those players stand out when you're looking at the PPR points. And so, I'm trying to get the full view of who these players are, and I definitely like looking at that. Whereas some of like the lesser players, definitely aren't putting up nearly as much. You get like a Malik Washington at 2.07 compared to a Jacob Cohen at a 3.35. It might not sound like a huge difference, but it's a pretty substantial difference there when you're talking about per touch.
Yeah, that's actually one that I haven't used, but it makes sense. Like overall, I can see why that would work out, and I'm gonna go look into that after this.
Yeah, and once, like, I definitely, if I had to pick one to like take out of the model, I'd probably be that one. But I've also found that it definitely helps as well. There's certain players that maybe it doesn't all make sense why they don't necessarily have a certain yards per team pass attempt or whatever, but they just score fantasy points, and fantasy points in college begat fantasy points in the NFL. It just works out sometimes. All right, Aaron, we've gotten pretty nerdy, but what do you think? You got another one for us?
No, that was excellent. I really did like that actually. How about yards per route run? Is that something that you guys use at all on the college side? I know people use that on the NFL side.
So, I mean, as far as for me, it's kind of tough to get some of these metrics that you can easily get in the NFL. And I'm not saying they're not out there. Just you might have to subscribe to a certain website or something that I'm not, subscribed to. So I definitely have, some. I think yards per team pass attempt is pretty easy because all you really have to do is look at the yards for the player and then the yards for the team, and it's simple math at that point. Yards per route run, you have to really start diving deep into stats. So it's not something that I use on the college side. But I don't know about Nelly. What about you?
No, I haven't either. I've actually been meaning to dig into that. I just got access to some of that information, so it's definitely something that I want to look into. I think intuitively, like it might be helpful for Devy for the younger players, right? Because the difference between yards per route run and yards per team pass attempt is it'll uncover guys with a lower snap share that are very productive and are essentially earning a higher snap share in the future. So like for freshmen, right, if a freshman is effective on yards per route run, intuitively as spots open up, they'll get a higher snap share and it'll translate. But I think once you're looking at like third and fourth year guys, yards per route run should line up pretty evenly with yards per team pass attempt. And if they don't, it's probably a bit of a problem, right? Because if you're a third or fourth year guy and you're not seeing a large percentage of the snap share, then that's a question mark.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a great point. It is. Even just on the NFL side, just looking at routes sometimes can tell you as somebody, earning more of a role and things like that. So when you're looking at the college side, that could definitely help you out. Maybe they don't have a giant role. Think of some of the players on Ohio State last year. Like they didn't have a huge role, but maybe they were earning targets when they were getting yards when they were running routes, even though it wasn't a ton of routes, like that kind of thing. So getting that information probably could be pretty important if you're able to get your hands on it. Like I said, I haven't really looked into where to find that information, but if it's available, I might have to. It's actually not a bad idea.
Yeah, it's on PFF.
Okay.
I think that's the only place that I know of that has that information.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes sense. I haven't really looked into their college stuff, but yeah, I like that a lot, actually. That might be something I need to look into. Aaron, you got another one for us, or you want me to throw one out there?
No, you go for it. But I do think it makes sense that it's on PFF. I suppose they're the ones that are watching it and kind of writing down all the routes that people are running. But
yeah, that's the thing. Somebody has to be watching it for this. Like, this is the one where the nerds lose. Somebody has to be watching the film and actually figuring out the amount of the routes at this point.
Go for it, John.
So actually, I have a very simple one that I think might get overlooked sometimes just because it's such a simple stat, and it's yard per reception. I think sometimes, like I said, it just kind of gets overlooked, but you can find out a lot about a player just by looking at yards per reception. You can find out who they are, at least in their own offense. If sometimes it might take a little bit of digging if they just have a completely garbage quarterback. You have to compare it towards other players, on their own team and that kind of thing. But, if you kind of look at, like a Rondell Moore in college, he didn't have a very large or high yards per reception, and then he goes into the NFL, and guess what? He doesn't have a very high yards per reception. Like things didn't change, and I always kind of looked at that. I was really just getting into Devy last year. At least like looking at the numbers and all that kind of stuff when Rondell came out. I didn't know a lot about the player, and I just had a lot of people telling me how he was going to be this amazing player because he was so explosive. He could squat 600 pounds, even though he was 4'9", and he just was this amazing player. And I'm looking at his stats, and I'm like, well, he never exceeded 13 yards per reception, at Purdue. And they're like, oh, well, he had a low ADOT, like that kind of thing. I'm like, yeah, but if you're that explosive, you're going to break off run. Like, you're going to break off huge plays. And it just never really made sense to me. Not to say that he's a bad player or anything like that. It didn't seem like he was going to be this like Jameson Williams or Jalen Waddle or, whoever you want to compare him to. So I do think that while, once again, it's not the end-all be-all or anything like that, that sometimes yards per reception can be a pretty simple way to look at the player and just say, hey, I think this player is going to be a stud if he's able to get on the field and really, show what he can do.
Now with that, because that's a good point, and yards per reception is essentially derivative of two metrics that I like. How do you, like, if you see someone has like a 25 yards per reception season, like, is that a good thing? Is there ever like too high of a yards per reception season?
Probably. I mean, I think, some of the best players, like I'm actually looking at it right now. Once again, like a Quentin Johnston, Isaiah Nair, they're up around 21. Dontavian Wicks, 21. Jaden Bray, 20. And then you get into like JSN, 15.7. Xavier Worthy, 15.8. I'm not, once again, it's not that just because they're at 15.8 that all of a sudden they're worse than a Dontavian Wicks or anything like that. I still think once you start getting into that 15, 16, 17 range, it shows that you can do it. You can get those big plays. It might not be your whole game. With somebody like JSN, we know that he's a slot player, and so he's just, by definition, going to have lower ADOTs and so a 15.8 is actually great for him, whereas an outside receiver, you probably are looking more like a 19, 20, 21. But to answer your question, I don't see too many 25s. Usually I would assume that that's more of like a really small sample kind of thing. And, I really don't think that it would be somebody having 1,400 yards and 25 yards per reception. Like, that would be pretty wild. And honestly, like, at that point, I would say that they would not be too high. They're just a really good wide receiver at that point.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. If someone's putting up significant yardage, there's someone out there who has he had a season where he averaged like 30 yards per reception and like on significant volume. I don't remember the name off the top of my head. It was like, I think he's the wide receivers coach at Texas now. Sorry, small little tangent there. But no, I did want to circle back because you keep mentioning ADOT, and I mentioned how yards per reception is kind of a derivative of a couple metrics. And when you think about it, yards per reception is really ADOT, right? Average depth of target combined with YAC ability, so yards after catch ability. And both of those things are important to look at. ADOT is very transitive to the NFL level. Like, generally speaking, how you're used in college is how a pro team is going to use you as well, right? Like a team like Rondell Moore had a short ADOT. He was never going to become a deep guy. Like, things can change and shift a little bit, but generally speaking, you are who you are, and the teams draft you for who you are. But then also, YAC ability is important. We know that, like, you look at all the top wide receivers in the NFL, all those guys are dynamic athletes that win after the catch as well as winning to catch the ball, right? It just shows a certain level of dynamism. So if you combine like a solid ADOT, because you also don't want to be too deep of a guy, because then you're probably a low volume guy. Also, if you combine like a 9-10 ADOT with like 5 yards after the catch per reception, that's getting you to the 15 yards per reception that you were talking about, and that's exactly what you want to be looking for.
Exactly. And Aaron, I know we've talked pretty nerdy about some of these things, but I'm pretty sure you can handle yards per reception. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely love it. And bringing up things like Yak, those are things that I look for on film. But it's just so nice sometimes just to be able to pull up the numbers and see, oh yeah, this guy was actually doing it. So I do think that it's meaningful to see how a player's deployed because that can influence, let's say, yards per reception. How Rondale Moore was used in college probably should have given us a few more red flags of like, oh wait, he was not running down the field. He was not running 9 routes. He wasn't getting deep down there. He was used underneath, and he broke some bigger plays where he might not be able to do that at the next level against NFL competitions. So I do think that the analytics and watching the film, sometimes we come to the same conclusions. We use different pathways to do so. So no, I thought great points there by both of you.
Yeah, and once again, I don't think that it's saying that just because a Rondale Moore had a 13 yards per reception that like anyone that has a 13 yards per reception is going to be bad by any means. You still have to look at the offense. Once again, I think it is important to look at other players, like how that's happening, because you look like a Jordan Addison. He had a 13.5 yards per reception in his career, and I think I have it for his best season as well. But then he has a 15.8 for his best season. So, like you do see a progression there, even though he hasn't always been this like bigger play receiver, like that kind of thing. And a lot of the top players really do have, like a 15, 16, 17 yards per reception. So like that's definitely around about where you want to get. Even though you might have some other players, like mentioned before, some of these like smaller school players it's probably a little bit easier for them to get some bigger numbers. So just because they have a 21 doesn't necessarily mean they're the best player in college football or anything like that. All right, boys. What else do you have? Do you have any other big ones that stand out for the wide receivers, or do we want to start looking at some other positions?
Yeah, I think we've exhausted the wide receiver metrics pretty heavily. Let's pivot.
All right, but before we get out of the wide receivers, why don't we go ahead and dive into this tweet that we saw on Twitter, and let me see if I can bring it up. And it was from @FF_Dirty Mike, and he was asking for some help on ranking certain players. He was having some trouble, and the 5 players were Isaiah Nair, Cedric Tillman, Dontavian Wicks, Jacob Coing, and Jaden Reed. Aaron, as your combination of analytics and film, why don't you tell us at least do you want to start at 5 or 1?
So I can start with the top, just because I have a little bit towards the bottom. I'm not quite as picky, but I do think that there's 2 guys that are sticking up a little bit above the rest. So would you like me to just get right into it?
Yeah, why don't you give us the 2 that stand out, and then we can get into the nitty gritty after that.
Sounds good. And it's Isaiah Nair, Jacob Coing as the 2. And I understand that they did it at a lower level of competition. But now Nair going to Texas, Jacob Coing now, excuse me, ending up at Arizona, moving up to these Power 5 programs that are on the rise too. These programs that are hopefully becoming much better. Those guys were doing it at a young age. So that's something that we can't necessarily say for Dontavian Wicks, Cedric Tillman. Jaden Reed did it at a young age, but we've seen quite a few years go by where he kind of, through a transfer, and I don't know if it was an injury, but he's just a little bit older coming out. So I know Nair and Cowling, they'll both be seniors. They'll both have 4 years under their belts coming out next year, but just being slightly younger, moving up to that P5 level. And what they did, we talked earlier about, some of the yards, what was it, receiving yards market share and yards per attempt. I mean, they were dominant. Nair was 41%, and Cowing was 40% as far as market share. And if you put that in perspective of other guys, like Jordan Addison was 33%. Jackson Smith and Jigma, 32%. Quentin Johnston, 25%. Everybody loves Jermaine Burton, who's going to a good situation as well, but he was at 16% before. Of course, we're talking about higher level of competition there, but it does show how dominant those players were. And I really think that they're going to transition well to the next level. But there is some risk associated with them, which is why it is a very valid question. And I could see why other people would have different preferences. So what do you guys think in there?
Nelly, what do you think of those 2?
Yeah, so I think I would have those two as my top two as well. I'm a big fan. Um, as Aaron mentioned, they were absolutely dominant at the lower schools, and what I kind of like about them is there's more unknown with them, right? So like we don't have that big of a sample of these guys transferring up because these transfer rules are pretty new. Guys had to sit out before. Someone like Jaden Reed had to sit out for a year because he transferred when he was younger. Um, so there's more unknown with them. And then also a metric we didn't talk about. I know John has feelings about it as well as early declare, which is shown to be sticky. Guys who declare younger are usually better because if you put into context, the NFL just wants them to come into the league, generally speaking. Now, these guys were at G5 schools. They were at like poor schools. They didn't get NFL exposure. So while they're seniors, right, there's like context for why they wouldn't have declared. So like there's more unknown. There's kind of context for the red flags or question marks, however you want to kind of approach that. Um, but I'm big on kind of the wide range of outcomes that they come with.
Yeah, and I have them 1-2 as well. We're all in agreement here. I will admit that I had Coing above Nayer before the transfer to Texas, but it's really tough. I'm pretty sure Coing's at Arizona. Is that correct? And like not to say that they can't put out talent or anything like that, but Texas is going to have a much easier shot of sending Nayer to the NFL than Arizona is going to. And so while I mean they were very close to begin with, but it was Coing above. I definitely, like I said, I think Nayer has a little bit better of a shot. And so if I'm looking at the two of them on a draft board, I'm going to go ahead and go with Isaiah there. So we're all in agreement for 1 and 2. Nelly, why don't you go ahead and start us out with your 3? Let's see if we can continue the trend.
Yeah, so at 3, I have Dontavian Wicks. He has a pretty interesting trajectory in college. He didn't do anything his freshman year. Which is a bad sign. But freshman year is actually like the least important year. It's kind of contrary. Like early production is really good, but a lack of freshman year production isn't the end of the world as long as they show something in the sophomore year. Now he didn't do anything sophomore year, but that's because he was hurt, right? Like so, it wasn't that he wasn't good enough. He just simply was hurt. He didn't get the opportunity. And now third year he came out and he was very good as a third year guy. He had over 2 yards per team pass attempt, and I think he missed some games from injury as well. So on a per game level, I think it was even higher. So again, he's one of those guys where there's like a little bit more unknown with him. He only has 1 year on tape, so like it makes sense why he wouldn't have declared after 1 year. And he has one very, very good season under the belt, even when you age adjust it.
Yeah, and I like Wicks, and honestly, I'll just go ahead and say that he's not my 3, but he's not that far behind for me, honestly. I do like Wicks, and like you said, you can't really truly count his sophomore season against him because he missed the entire year. He didn't. It's not like he played half of the season or something like that. He literally missed the entire year. So he blew up last year when it mattered. I guess it wasn't enough for the NFL to truly care, and so he's right back at it, and he's going to hope that he can continue his ways. Aaron, do you have Wicks at 3, or you got somebody else there?
I actually don't. I have the next 3 guys quite similar, but I have Wicks a little bit lower. And for the reasons why, it's more so I thought there was some concerns, both tape-wise and analytically, just because Wicks had, a 25% market share. Not bad by any means, but not like he was this dominant force. And I do think that this next year at Virginia, there's Lavelle Davis coming back. There's the new coaching staff that might pass it less. So as far as if he's not getting this amazing target share and maybe the offense either takes a step back, stays similar, he's not going to have the crazy spike production that might catch the attention of an NFL team to give him day 1 or day 2 draft capital. And his yards per attempt, it was 2.17 this year as well. So considerably lower than some of the other guys we have already talked about. So those were a couple of things. And then just on film, I did have a little bit of concern with his yards after the catch ability, his yak ability. I know he broke off one big play, like 50-yarder, but there was nobody around him. Other than that, I just don't know if he's going to win deep at the next level, though he has really good size. So just some minor concerns. I don't hate him by any means. It probably sounds like I'm just, hating on the guy, but I firmly have him in that tier with those guys. I just have him actually last. So I have him fifth of that list that we are discussing.
Okay, so he's a hater. No, honestly, so I'll go ahead and start us off with the who would be my third, and I've talked about him on a previous pod, how much I'm a fan, and it's Jaden Reed. I really do love me some Reed. I think that we're gonna look at a super senior and be like, this is crazy. Why are we talking about this? But he's not. He's like he had the old school transfer policy. I'm not gonna count that against a guy. I'm sorry. Like I get the age thing, and like Nelly said, it does matter. Early declare matters. I have a discount for being a senior, and then another one for being a super senior in my model for Devy purposes and for the NFL. But but for Reed, he's being like severely discounted in the model because of who he is and like what year he is, and yet he still shows up because he started out great at Western Michigan. Obviously, the small school. But he started at freshman year, blew up. Then he transfers, has to wait 2 years. 2020 COVID season, they only play 7 games, so his stats don't look amazing. But it was actually decent for a first year in a larger school offense and trying to get acclimated to things. And then he blows up in his third technical year of playing football. And gets 1,000 yards, 17 yards per reception, which we talked about before. 10 touchdowns, like just everything about what he did was great. And I guess to me, I'm just not counting the age against him because I don't truly care. No one cares about Deebo Samuel's age right now. It just doesn't matter. So I'm gonna go ahead and not care about Jaden Reed's age. And I will say one thing that's tough about the model. With all these transfers, like we were talking about with Isaiah Nair earlier, Jacob Cohen, is I didn't have a lot of work to do before all these crazy transfers, where I had to like discount for this conference and then bump things up for this conference. But now, like with Texas and Western Michigan and whatever else, I have to look at these guys and go, all right, well, I have to count this season in this conference, and I have to count another season playing for Texas or whatever it might be. And it starts to get a lot more. I'm having to do a lot more work, guys. Can we stop with all these transfers, please?
I don't know if that's slowing down anytime soon.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And I think you made good points on Jaden Reed. Like we talked about him when we had Devy Dietz, Austin Nace on our last podcast. So people go back and listen to that because that was some excellent content there. So we don't need to rehash all that. I like him. I think he could be like the discount Jahan Dotson next year. Similar play styles, in my opinion. I think that there are very notable similarities there. But the guy that I actually have number 3 is going to be Cedric Tillman, just because he seems to edge Jaden Reed in the various categories that we talked about earlier. So as far as, just slightly better as far as reception and then yards, market share numbers, better yards per attempt. And honestly, I just think that Tennessee offense is going to go off this year. And the NFL is going to see the crazy numbers that Tillman is going to put up, and in my opinion, or my estimation, and the NFL is just going to love that huge spike in production, 2 years of production. I know he's like a 5th-year guy, so, everybody's going to have their thoughts on that. I guess my one question is the NFL going to like a 6'3", 215-pound wide receiver like Cedric Tillman if he doesn't test well? And I'm not 100% sold on that. I think he has enough speed and burst. I think I like his slightly more than Wicks, but I think that's the one question. Is he going to fit into what the NFL is looking for now? But I have him as the slight edge over Reed.
I get it, and I also get why Dirty Mike had some issues, ranking these players because, and Nelly can obviously touch on Tillman as he sees fit, but if you're just looking at Tillman's profile, you're gonna say dude's garbage. It took him 4 years, and he didn't do anything. And then you look at the games played and you go, okay, well, he was hurt a lot, or something. Like something happened, whether he wasn't on the field. I don't know the whole story, honestly, about why he wasn't on the field. All I know is he really wasn't on the field very much for 3 solid years. Then all of a sudden he just completely blows up in his senior season. And obviously it wasn't enough. Once again, just like with Jaden Reed or Dontavian Wicks or whoever, it wasn't enough for the NFL to care. But it was enough to put him on people's radar. Once again, you look at it, it's like it took 4 years. Why did it take 4 years? Is that injury history scary? Are there going to be knee concerns? I need to look into those kind of factors and figure out if there's going to be concerns about, possible inflammation and degradation and all that kind of stuff. But I will give Tillman some credit because I looked at his game log from last year, and it was almost like a tale of two halves of the season. He really started off pretty slow against not great competition, and so it doesn't look great. And then all of a sudden he blows up against Alabama of all teams. He 7 catches, 152 yards and a touchdown. Kentucky 79 yards and a touchdown. Georgia, the best defense of all time, 200 yards, 10 receptions, 200 yards and a touchdown. South Alabama 100 yards, Vanderbilt 100 yards, Purdue 150 yards and 3 touchdowns. So something clicked for Tillman, and it does make it difficult to rank him for, as far as I'm concerned. But, when you think about the fact that it's an SEC team and he's going to be on people's radars, I get why you're putting him there. I guess I'm just kind of I just need to see a little bit more. We saw it with Jaden Reed. He had the early production and then he did it again, even though he switched and he's older and all that kind of stuff. I just need to see it again. A half a season, we've seen some half seasons be amazing. Maybe not this amazing, but pretty damn good. And all of a sudden, they're just completely gone next year.
And I think you illustrated that really well, John. And I'll say that things started to click once they had Hendon Hooker in there. Newer coaching staff, it takes a while for some of these players who maybe were stuck in the old system to really catch on. So what Tillman did the second half of the season against just such tough competition, and they're running back everything the same this year, I like it. But yeah, very good points there.
Yeah, I also have Tillman 5th. I will also insert the caveat that I think he's probably one of the more likely guys to get high, fantasy relevant draft capital, because he's going to put up a lot of raw volume. And the NFL has seemed to like Tennessee wide receivers in the past. Velus Jones went in the 3rd round last year. The year before that, Josh Palmer went. So they're looking there, right? And he was better than Velus Jones last year. But it's tough to overlook 3 years of zero production without very much excuse for it. And Aaron makes a great point as well. His kind of wide receiver archetype, the NFL is moving away from that. He's a big guy. He's much more of a contested catch guy, whereas someone like Jaden Reed, he's returning kicks, returning punts. He's demonstrating that he's a weapon, he's a good football player. He's not just a good, go up and catch the ball wide receiver. So I worry about that. And the testing, which while I don't necessarily care about it, I know the NFL cares about it. And so in turn, I also kind of care about it. So I do have him 5th, and I have him a tier below the other guys. But also, like I said, I see the value because I think that he is one of the safer bets here to get solid draft capital.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up Velus Jones as well. While Tillman definitely outproduced Velus Jones, they kind of had a similar trajectory, which once Hendon Hooker came in, and that's when they both kind of blew up, if you will. And so I'm not high on Velus Jones at all. I'm not trying to compare the two players by any means. I would say that Tillman has a much better shot of actually being a good player. Once again, it's not maybe it's just the QB, bringing him up more than anything else. So I just need to see more of it. And then Aaron had asked about A.T. Perry, and are you thinking a similar player? Where would we have him in the ranks?
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of similarities to Cedric Tillman. Hadn't done much early in his career. Big, tall, even bigger. He's 6'5", Wake Forest wide receiver. It's just a system that likes to pass the ball. So again, that raw volume. Probably not going to be an amazing tester, athleticism-wise. So I have my doubts as far as NFL viability. But if we're talking C2C leagues where you want that college production, These guys like Tillman, A.T. Perry, definitely got to prop them up. But maybe that's kind of where you change your strategy just based on the format you're in. A little bit less Devy viability for Tillman and a A.T. Perry compared to the other guys we talked about.
Yeah, A.T. Perry is just kind of Tillman on like everything that we kind of explained about Tillman. Like A.T. Perry is just him on steroids. He's like 6'5". He literally is just a contested catch guy. So I worry about the transition to the NFL with him as well.
Yeah, I mean it's really tough. I think when you look at the sophomore season, albeit the 2020 season, and he had 15 catches, 211 yards. I'm assuming Wake Forest only played 6 games. I could be wrong about that. No, actually they played 9 games. So okay, so there was some injuries there. So maybe I'm wrong. I was gonna say that like that sophomore season kind of concerns me, but maybe it was more injury related than I was originally thinking. But I mean, he definitely put up a good amount of yardage. He was the top wide receiver on his team, so I don't mind having him there in that mix. I'd probably still put him at the bottom though, honestly. And we're not seeing too many 6'5" guys coming out and just being studs anymore. So it just really, obviously, like I'm never going to be like, oh, this guy's 6'5", he can't be good in the NFL. It just seems that we're kind of moving away from that at this point.
Yeah, I think I also one name that came to mind when this list came out was Zay Jones. Is like he's in this group of guys for me as well. I would put him like probably in between the Nair Cowing tier and the Wicks Reed tier.
You think it is Zay Flowers?
Yeah, what'd I say?
Okay, said Zay Jones. I was like, oh, no. Are we getting an NFL college mix right now?
Zay Jones. Oh no, I meant Zay Flowers. Yeah, Boston College.
I like it. Well, don't get John going on him.
Oh so, man, that's my baby. Can't be putting him in this mix.
No, I have him in this mix too now, but I have him actually probably ranked the highest from. Actually, he's right there with Nair and Cowling for me. Honestly,
shut your mouth. No, I don't have them graded that different, but he's clearly the one. If we were just talking about those 6 players, he would clearly be the one for me. But yeah, I love me some Zay. Not Zay Jones, but Zay Flowers. I do love it. I think, and we talked once again. This is another player that we talked about last week, and it's another player that I think people are just concerned about the size. And if he could bump up like a few pounds, then all of a sudden he would, like people wouldn't be concerned about it anymore. And next thing you know, like you have a stud on your hands because he hits all those things that we were talking about: the yards per reception, the market share, the yards per team pass attempt, all that kind of stuff. Like I love me some Zay. He gets hated on too much for his size. But unless there was any rebuttal to my Zay Flowers love, then we can go ahead and jump into another position.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to rebuttal there. Not worth my time. No, I'm just kidding. No, I was actually just gonna. We don't have to break down every one of these guys because just these guys have various holes in their profile. But do any of you have like strong takes on what we should be doing with the Raheem Jarrett's, the Marvin Mims, those even Jermaine Burdens? Quentin Johnston, I know, is a guy that John's brought up those concerns with too. And some of them, they don't have the best analytical components of their profiles. A lot of them flash on film. A lot of them have either good recruiting backgrounds or just people rank them very highly in the community for one reason or another. I'm curious if you have any quick thoughts on them, but sorry to get into a side tangent.
No, you're good. Honestly, I love it. I think I have Mims and Raheem Jarrett like literally back to back, but it's after Dontavian Wicks. So I think that kind of tells you everything that you need to know about how I feel about those players.
Yeah, I think we actually talked about them on Twitter at some point. I agree that I have Mims and Jarrett back to back. They have almost identical profiles, like 1.6 yards per team pass attempt as a freshman, 1.7 as a sophomore. I'm concerned about both those guys, but they do have the pedigree, so I don't have him as low as John does. I don't think Quentin Johnston belongs. Like I don't have questions about Quentin Johnston. He was very good, especially when you factor in that he missed some games as a sophomore. So, like, if you do it on a per game basis as a sophomore, his metrics look better. And that also goes for Jermaine Burton, who is also going to a much more friendly situation. So I have him in between those tiers of I have Johnston in my second wide receivers tier, but then Burton would be the next tier, and then I have those other rising juniors in the tier below that.
Yeah, I agree, and I do definitely have Johnston and Burton much higher than those other two. What was it, Jared and Mims? Yeah, so I don't want to act like I have them all in the same tier or anything like that, because that's definitely not the case. But I am, Aaron was touching on the fact that I am lower on Johnston than some other people, because while I think he's better than those players, I'm not excited about those players at all, and I, it's like, that's not saying much. You're talking about some bottom feeders at that point. So I don't love Johnston, but he's a lot better than those guys. What about you, Aaron? How you didn't tell us how you would have him?
Yeah, I honestly, sometimes I probably care too much about what the consensus, either ADP or just thoughts are in the community. And, I had Mims a little bit higher than most of the guys we talked about tonight, but in a similar tier to the Nayers, Cowing. So it's not that I had those guys, in a tier way above. But I don't know. I think that there's some things to be excited about with both of them, especially taking a huge step forward this year. And that's really what it takes. They have to break out. If they continue doing what they're doing, Jarrett and Mims, they're not going to cut it. So I am anticipating a step forward, but I realize that based on what they're doing right now, they probably don't quite deserve it. So a little bit more of the projecting, but at the end of the day, this Devy game, you have to project a lot, and those guys have some legit talent. So that's kind of my thoughts there.
Yeah, I really try to, with the model especially, like I really try to stay out of the pedigree game as much as possible. Like I might give somebody a small boost. Like Jermaine Burton, I gave him a boost because he moved from Georgia to Alabama. He's gonna have a better shot of getting drafted because of that. Even though he's still in the SEC, like nothing changed, but yet he probably has a better shot. And so I gave him a very small boost because of that, because otherwise he'd probably be even lower than some of these guys. But he's not the greatest. But I really try to stay out of that game, and I really just stick with the conferences. Like I look at the conferences and I say, like, this is what you should be doing in this conference. This is what you should be doing in this conference, and so on and so forth. And if you're doing it, then you're going to be ranked well. And like you said, Mims and Jared just aren't doing it. So it's pretty easy for me to have them lower. But I mean, they're still top 20 guys. Like I'm not saying like they're completely garbage or anything either. But I think we've spent quite a bit of time on these wide receivers. Although I mean, it's fun. We're having fun here talking numbers, which is quite nerdy. But let's go ahead and get into the most important position that everyone says you can never get right. No one knows how or why these guys are good. And, tell us, Nelly, what are you looking for with the QBs?
Yeah, so there's kind of two different components, right? There's trying to predict the draft capital, and then there's trying to predict the NFL success. The big thing for me with predicting draft capital, my favorite metric is adjusted yards per attempt. So it takes yards per attempt, which is pretty self-explanatory, and then it adds certain adjustments for touchdowns and interceptions. So it adds weighting to that, and that's pretty indicative of if a player is draftable. Like you have to be an efficient college quarterback for the NFL to be interested in you, whether you're like an accurate deep ball thrower, or it's just like your efficiency is the single most important thing that you show to the NFL for them to care about you. The other thing that I really care about, and this kind of circles back to the Malik Willis thing, is rushing market share matters. The NFL actually does care about it. Like it kind of makes up for a lack of efficiency. It's almost like a lever. Like if you're Lamar Jackson, you're rushing for 50% rushing market share in college. You don't need to be the most efficient passer in the world. There's like a little bit of a scale. But since this is fantasy, right, rushing is kind of a cheat code for quarterbacks. So that also matters like when I'm looking at prospects, because I care if they have a high ceiling as well. Like someone like Anthony Richardson, who actually we don't have that many numbers on, but he's going to be a high volume rusher in college. And so he's someone who's I'm interested in Devy because he has that ceiling.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it, but are you looking at raw production when it comes to the rushing? Are you looking at just the market share in general, or are there other ways of determining how good of a rusher they actually are?
Yeah, so I don't know which one is necessarily the most correlative. I use rushing market share as in like percent of team rushing yards. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I've also explored factoring out sack yards, because college stats for some reason feel like they should include sack yards in the rushing yards. But at the end of the day, every quarterback's also getting sacked, so it's somewhat linear in terms of how that affects the quarterbacks. Some get sacked more than others, but also sacks are a negative thing. Like they're not always the quarterback's fault, but sometimes they are. So ultimately, I've kind of moved away from trying to adjust that out, because it's also not the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of work. What about you, Aaron? What are you looking for with the QBs, and what do you think of rushing market share?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have a lot of thoughts on it because, like you said, it is important. How much we weigh that really depends on the analyst, right? So some of us are really shooting for the moon all the time versus, um, some strategies just differ. So I'm curious less about follow-up questions. Well, how about a player who does both? Hendon Hooker. So Hendon
Ooh.
Hooker transferring to Tennessee now is in this passing offense that's going to throw it down the field and put up a lot of volume. But he's also had pretty good rushing market share numbers just based off the top of my head, and then also a nice yards per attempt. So I don't know. Is that a guy who you're very much into this year?
Man, I loved Hendon Hooker last year. I was like, Hendon Hooker is like the guy no one's talking about. I don't understand it. He has like 11 adjusted yards per attempt, like best in the country. He's rushing for 20 plus of his team's rushing yards. And he went back to school for his 6th year, which it doesn't matter as much for quarterbacks, right? But like it begs the question. This guy has a degree, almost definitely. He probably also has a grad degree over 5 years. And yet he's still staying in school. So that kind of gives me question marks. But at the same time, we just saw Kenny Pickett get drafted after 5 years in school. But also Hendon Hooker is going to be 25 on draft night next year. Like that's the only quarterback we've seen close, or the only quarterback we've seen drafted in the first round older than that is Brandon Weeden. So like there's a relatively small samples, and this is the first time that players had years affected by COVID. So you can make excuses for it, but like that is something that I can't quite get around. Like I think it limits his upside being that old.
Yeah, makes sense. And I've heard, and I can't remember who did this, but somebody who was very experienced as far as evaluating quarterbacks, and they weren't necessarily analytically based. They were more on the NFL level. Some kind of high up person came onto a podcast and talked about a couple of the big things that he looks for when evaluating NFL prospects and maybe predicting, who's going to get drafted. And oftentimes it's not always the guys who've just had one flash year where it's just kind of random. And usually they don't pan out, like the Mitchell Trubisky's and guys like that who don't have a large sample size. So we do have a large sample size in college of Hendon Hooker and a lot of starting experience. So I guess starting experience is to circle back around that one thing that it just really sticks with me. That is an important thing. But like you said, is it too extreme with Hooker? Is that going to scare people off? That's the question that we got to weigh when we're trying to invest in him as an asset.
Yeah, and I think we're already seeing some of what you're talking about with like the 1 year kind of guy happening with Kenny Pickett. Whether it's camp talk and all that kind of yada yada, but they're talking about him running with the threes right now. Not even being close to being a starter. And it doesn't truly surprise me. I mean, I think he's better than running with the threes, but I also don't think he's some stud or anything like that. Now with Hooker, he wasn't. You're saying he has starting experience in the past, and he did, but he wasn't great in the past either. It was really this year, once he got to Tennessee, Everything got better. He moved up 3 percentage points in completion rate. He moved up in adjusted yards per attempt, like Nelly was talking about, substantially. Substantially his best year, and had a 31 touchdown to 3 interception rate. So like everything was so much better. The previous season, although not nearly as many pass attempts or anything like that, he had a 9 to 5 touchdown to interception rate. So it just shows you. I mean, it's like literally a completely different world. And that doesn't mean that he didn't take a step forward or anything like that. But the fact that he went back to school, it's really tough to get too excited about him. Now, just to play and have some fun with it, I have Hendon Hooker as my QB 21. Okay, overall. That's mostly because of age, and years in school, that kind of thing. But just for shits and giggles, I went ahead and made it so that he's actually only a third-year player in the model. And he actually moves up to QB 7. So overall, so I mean, it shows you like that it's mostly the age. It's not necessarily the play there. And I mean, it was a really good season. Like I just said, he had 31 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 181 passer rating, and an 11.3 adjusted yards per attempt. Like, it was a great year. It's just, we need a little bit more. Once again, going back to the Cedric Tillman thing, we need more than 1 year or half a season, and it just so happens that we're talking about the same exact team too.
Yeah, there's such a big pool of guys beyond for 2023, beyond Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, where we have a bunch of 4th and 5th year guys, a couple of 3rd year guys spattered in, but there is so little to kind of differentiate them. So I guess from my perspective, I'm looking at who's been efficient. But there's a certain level, like it's really tough to, because you also have to project and you have to care about how the NFL sees it. And some of those things are truly just very, very hard to quantify. Like a guy like Will Levis, his profile is terrible, right? But I'm sure, John, he's very, very low in your model because his efficiency is terrible, really, really bad. It would be one of the worst first-round quarterback picks of all time. But he's getting hype, and he still has 1 more year to go, and so it's hard to all it takes for him is 1 year of efficiency, which would be surprising, but it wouldn't be unheard of. And it's hard to kind of project that because quarterbacks are so complex with kind of how all these statistics are derived, and there's just so much that goes into it.
Yeah, I think other people have talked about this before. I'm not breaking ground here or anything like that, but I think when you're looking at one season, it needs to be that Joe Burrow level of season. Like you need to blow my socks off, kind of deal, not just be good. So I need to see either 2 years of you being good, or I need to see just this amazing year where everything truly clicked for you, and then I can get behind having it. And once again, it doesn't mean that Hendon Hooker can't move up with another great season this year. It's just I'm not betting on it, and I'm definitely not drafting him in a Devy league like that. Just not doing it.
Yeah. Well, if you want 2 years, just we'll have to wait to see about this fall, because I think that'll be year number 2 for Hooker really showing out.
Ooh, I like it. All right, so I threw out my ranking, and I'm not trying to we have a C2C or campus draft coming up here pretty quickly, but I just told you I'm not drafting him, Aaron. But how high do you have Hooker? Because it sounds like you're a pretty big fan.
Yeah, I'm taking a similar approach to what Devy Dietz laid out last podcast, as far as the kind of just wait on quarterback approach. So though I have him ranked within my top 10 in all of quarterbacks in the Devy landscape, I don't think I'm going to be taking him in the first, 5, 8, 10 rounds maybe, just because I don't want to invest in quarterbacks. Like Nelly said, there's just so little to differentiate all those guys. So the fact that I have them, within that top 10-ish in the whole Devy pool, I guess it means that I might be fairly high on him. But I know that there's people who have him as like a top 3 option. So in the grand scheme of things, I do think he's in a big tier with a lot of players. And I guess I laid out why I'm a little bit higher on him.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. And honestly, like, there's a lot of guys that I have like slightly ahead of him that probably shouldn't be ahead of him. So it's like 21's probably a little crazy, honestly. But I just wanted to make a point. Like, don't be that old. Go to the NFL. But a couple other things. Honestly, like I keep my QB model pretty simplistic because I think that you're just looking for a general sense of if they're good and not necessarily like, with the wide receivers, I'm looking at quite a few metrics and just trying to figure out who they are as a player. I'm not necessarily trying to figure out who the QBs are as a player. I'm just trying to figure out, can you actually get the ball from point A to point B, like that kind of thing. So things I'm looking at are, completion rate, very simple, stat, like nothing too crazy. You don't have to overweigh it or anything like that. But then one that I do weigh pretty heavily is interception rate. And, it might get overlooked sometimes, but, interception rate's going to show you like what kind of player they are. And, not to say that a player with a high interception rate can't be good, but we don't see too many guys with like a 3-4% interception rate in college all of a sudden become this like stud in the NFL. And so, you can kind of wipe out quite a few players just by looking at that interception rate and just saying like, yep, it's probably not going to happen, guys.
That makes sense. I mean, the NFL cares about that a lot. They care about turnovers. That's like such a big like turnovers. That just gets drilled down over and over. So like, I can see why that would happen. Do you have any quarterbacks on the Devy landscape that you maybe think are like undervalued or who are your favorite Devy names at the quarterback position outside of like the big names that everyone knows of?
I wouldn't even say favorite per se, but I guess like underrated, because I've definitely heard some people hating on Tyler Van Dyke. And, like, I really think that he showed out, at least this past season in a big way. We just talked about like 1 year, but he's obviously younger and everything. Once again, I'm not like absolutely in love with him. He's a clear teardrop, below, like the top guys and even, beyond that. But I definitely like, what he did last year. And if he can grow from there, like I'm definitely going to be excited. If he can continue on this year, then I'm going to be excited for him next year. I know like my boy Kevin at Du Bois on Devy Royale is not a Van Dyke lover. So, like I just feel like he's kind of underrated, or at least at the very least, people are just saying like, I don't know who he truly is yet. And yet, like I'm sitting there going, I'm a pretty big fan.
Yeah, no, that's a great call out. He had sneakily almost as good of a year as Bryce Young last year in terms of efficiency, and he's not mobile, right? But he had a higher rushing market share than Bryce Young did last year. So like, I think the difference is probably, well, I don't want to say it's overstated because Bryce Young is Bryce Young, but Tyler Van Dyke is very good in his own right.
Yeah, I mean, once again, I'm not in love with him or anything like that, but I think he has the ability to take that next step this year and truly show that he's like ready to be in the NFL. Aaron, how's the film looking on over there?
Yeah, no, I really like Tyler Van Dyke. Have him just slightly higher than Hendon Hooker, actually. So pretty high on Van Dyke. The lack of scrambling. I mean, yeah, it's not great, but you know what? If he's a good quarterback, he's a good quarterback. I think he could take a step forward if that new coaching staff doesn't hold him back. I was going to just throw out Grayson McCall.
Oh, my boy.
Yeah, I know. John loves it. I'm assuming, Nelly, you might have some thoughts on him, but as far as just looking at some of those statistics you threw out there, he checks out with QBR, yards per attempt, the TD to interception rate, the rushing yards market share, completion percentage. All of them are comping really well to what NFL quarterbacks should have in college. But if we are going back to maybe the film, okay, the system, how is he going to translate to any sort of an NFL offense? And then is he going to get maybe that smaller school appreciation, maybe like a Zach Wilson did? But if you go back and remember what Zach Wilson looked like, I mean, he was killing it pre-draft as far as the workouts. He's got a super great arm, and that's what the NFL loves, right? They love the Josh Allens, the Zach Wilsons, and I'm not sure that Grayson McCall quite has that, though the statistics might say, oh, he was great on the deep ball. I don't know. I might need to see that a little bit more this season from him. But yeah, Grayson McCall's another guy who I like sticks out with some of the metrics that you guys are talking about.
Yeah, it might not be a great name to mention right now, but I also remember when Deshaun Watson was being talked about how weak his arm was, and yet he ended up being a pretty good player, although not the smartest player. I was actually about to bring up Grayson McCall because I actually have him a tier ahead of Tyler Van Dyke. I love me some Grayson McCall. I really do. And I probably shouldn't be saying this right before we start our campus draft, but man, I do love me some Grayson.
So any chance, Nelly, that Grayson McCall could get day one capital next year? What are you thinking?
That's the ultimate question with him, right? Like, because those efficiency numbers are absurd. I don't know. I struggle to see it just because he's at Coastal Carolina and because that system is like he doesn't have a ton of passing volume. So while the efficiency stats are nuts, like putting like 100 leading stats because of that, and it's a little bit of a gimmicky system as well. Now I think day two is very, very realistic, but I think day one it's not something that I would be expecting. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and it's really hard to argue that. I mean, I can't sit here and tell you that somebody from Coastal Carolina is going to be this, top 10 pick or anything like that. As much as I love the player, but I really, I told you, Nelly, before, when we were talking about Malik Willis, like I really tried to stay away from the draft capital game. I really try to just look at the player and figure out if I like the player or not, and I like the player. So I'm all in, baby. Was there anyone else that like truly stands out, or maybe somebody that's being like pushed up that you're like, oh, well, you had already talked about Will Levis, and I definitely agree with you. But were there any other players that like truly stand out, like based on the metrics that we were talking about here?
There's no one else that truly stands out. I'll say one name that I'm really intrigued by is Phil Jerkovich at Boston College. He had a injury plagued season last year, so I think he played 6 games. He missed the first half of the season. But when he came back, he was very efficient. He had over 9 adjusted yards per attempt, which is very good. And he ran for over 50 yards a game, which I think people don't realize. This dude, like, he's athletic, he runs the ball, and he's successful at it. And he's 6'5". He's got a strong arm. He was a top recruit. Like, he has the pedigree. And he was also on some draft boards last year before he didn't come out. So he's one of those guys in that big pool of quarterbacks that is one of those guys that's kind of rising to the top for me.
Phil Jerkovich, the guy that Brian Kelly said was the best quarterback prospect he'd ever worked with or signed or whatever.
and then he didn't play him.
Yep.
I will say him getting hurt really killed Zay Flowers. So like Zay still had a good year, but I think he could have been in that top tier of players had we been talking about Phil Jerkovich not getting hurt last year.
Absolutely. They're super correlated, and I think a big reason why Flowers came back was because Jerkovich came back.
Yeah, I said that literally last week. I feel like Flowers would have been in the NFL right now had it, he not gotten hurt, because it just, even though I don't necessarily know if Jerkovich is actually that great, he was 1,000 times better than Grossel or whatever the hell his name was.
So if we're comping guys, we're throwing out the Deshaun Watson comps, right? Phil Jerkovich comp. What do you guys think? Big Ben Roethlisberger? It's not an off the field thing, it's purely like on the field, like big guy. Right. He's got mobility, right? He gives you a little bit of that scrambling upside, get outside the pocket. 6'5", 226. Who knows? He might be even bit bigger than that. I don't know. But good arm. I don't know.
He's more mobile than Ben was. I think that's an important point. Like, I actually read an article about him. He lost 40 pounds in the offseason, and so maybe Big Ben would have been a good comp pre-weight loss. But I think now, like, it apparently helped his game a ton and helped with his mobility. I'm trying to think of a comp of like a big guy that moves well. I mean, the instant name that comes to mind is like a Josh Allen play style. But that's, first of all, you don't want to comp a quarterback prospect to Josh Allen, and I won't do that because Josh Allen was a terrible prospect. And Josh Allen as an NFL player is also a tough comp to make because he's one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And so that's lofty expectations, but more from a play style perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that, because when people comp players to Josh Allen, it just blows my mind. I get very upset. Don't comp people to Josh Allen. But yeah, with Jerkovich, I don't know. It's tough. And I definitely wouldn't do the Ben Roethlisberger comp, although it is kind of tough. Once again, going with like the small school guy that dominated versus the like, I don't know, not the like toughest conference, but like a better conference that hasn't truly dominated. I really think with Phil, it's that senior season just really hurt a lot, man. Like we just had such a small sample, but he wasn't great in that small sample. Everything numbers wise came down except for like the adjusted yards per attempt. And once again, going to like the interception rate, it was pretty high, even though very small sample. So not saying like that's the end all be all or anything like that, but it just wasn't a great year, and we needed to see him take a step forward, because I was like, I don't want to say I was high on Jerkovich last year, but at the same time, I definitely wasn't low on him, and now I'm like, I don't know, it just really hurt, especially when now he has to go into his super senior year, and we just got done talking about all these players. We're like, we're not excited about these guys. They truly have to show us that they're special, and I don't know that he's actually special.
Yeah, and I think to add with Jerkovich, what we're asking quarterbacks to do nowadays, we are asking them to be a little bit more mobile, a little bit more of that rushing upside. So, yeah, I can understand the Big Ben thing, but I just think play style wise, yeah, Jerkovich, I mean, he might run more, but otherwise some similarities. But I would say another rushing market share type of player that I'm interested in is Malik Cunningham, Louisville. You know what? He has a good yards per attempt as far as his time as a starter there. So at least he has that going for him passing wise. But yes, he's a rough player right now, right? He's not polished. He's not super well developed. I don't know what the NFL is going to think. I mean, they barely even drafted Lamar Jackson as a first rounder. This guy's not as good as Lamar Jackson. But at the end of the day, maybe there's a chance that Malik Cunningham really steps forward this year as a pure passer. I still kind of doubt it. It's a long shot, but just a guy I'm paying attention to. And obviously I love his production on the college fantasy side of things too.
Yeah, I mean, he has the rushing ability. He has that high yards per carry, which, I don't look at yards per carry in the NFL, but I do look at it on the college side. You kind of can put guys into tiers when you look at yards per carry. Like Lamar Jackson, 6 yards per carry. Malik Cunningham, 6 yards per carry. Not comparing them and saying like they're the same exact rusher, but I'm also saying they're in the same tier or whatever. Like they're similar in that nature. So. I don't hate the call. I'm not overly excited about Malik Cunningham. It's another one, fifth year player. We keep talking about all these fifth year players. I don't want to be excited about these guys. And like I guess when it's all said and done, it's gonna boil down to what Nelly's talking about with the draft capital. That's when it's gonna really matter. So for now, I'm not drafting any of them that we just talked about in Devy. But in C2C, maybe I'll grab me some Malik Cunningham. You never know. No, no, I'm definitely not grabbing Malik Cunningham, but I was just saying it on the pod.
Not if I have anything to do with it, John.
I'm
just kidding. I already have him in one league, so you can have him if you want him. Maybe.
All right, and then probably the easiest position to talk about and to look at analytically is the running back position. And so I don't even know that there's too many things that you have to look at, because when it's all said and done, the only thing that matters is draft capital. but Nelly, what are you looking for? The few things that do matter beyond that.
Yeah, so I guess the ultimate goal there is to predict draft capital, right? So I guess for me, when I'm looking at it, I'm looking for someone who has workhorse size, because someone's not growing 4 inches in college. Like Devin Achane is like a really good player, but he's not someone with with a high fantasy ceiling because he might get the draft capital, which we just talked about. But like, I also care about how they project as a fantasy asset. So I look for someone with workhorse size. And then in terms of specific metrics, I like receptions market share here because I think it's important as well that the players show that they're able to catch the ball because, again, transitions to a strong fantasy asset. And then yards per team attempt is kind of the main metric I use. It's very similar to yards per team pass attempt, but it's total yards divided by total team plays. And that just kind of shows, how effective this player is within their offense, but it also kind of takes into account for if they're productive. And then one last thing is I've kind of been experimenting with it, and I know someone else on Noah Hills is doing it as well, is kind of looking at how effective a player is relative to the rest of their backfield. So like Zach Evans, looking at his yards per carry compared to everyone else in his backfield. Like the whole backfield has 7 yards per carry, so his 7.5 yards per carry is less impressive. But things like that I think are important to get. It scales those kind of basic metrics down to kind of situational conditions.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I guess probably the most important thing is size. Are you going to have that workhorse size? Or are you going to have that size that the NFL covets? And so yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I don't use the yards per attempt when it comes to the running backs. I don't really get into that, but I definitely do use the yards per carry over team average, like what you were talking about. I think it makes a lot of sense. If you're better than your teammates, that's a good step forward for being pretty good in the NFL. Once again, not an end all be all. And with the running backs, I really try to just kind of like what I was talking about with the with some of these other players. I kind of just try to put them into tiers. Like, do you have the size? Do you have the do you have that ability? I don't want to get too crazy into production because production with the running backs isn't always a good thing. Like that's getting more into like C2C versus Devy, like that kind of thing. Like production's great for the C2C part, but when it comes to Devy, production doesn't always mean they're going to be a good player for Devy purposes. And so I try not to get too crazy with, like getting into their full yardage and all that kind of stuff. But one other thing that I touched on earlier with the wide receivers that I do use for the running backs as well is points per touch, PPR points per touch. And so like, it's kind of looking at a little bit of everything. Are you able to break off big plays? Are you able to score a lot of touchdowns? Are you able to catch a lot of balls? Like that kind of thing. So I think that it kind of gives you a good idea of like who they are as a player. And, if they have a pretty high PPR points per touch, then they're probably going to be a pretty good NFL player when it's all said and done. So those are like kind of the main things. BMI, obviously, breakaway run rate is another one that I try to look at. Are you able to break off big plays, or are you just a plotter, like that kind of thing. But Aaron, what do you think of those metrics, and do you have any others that you try to look at?
I like it. So when I'm watching it back, I really like to see just can they make a guy miss? Are they breaking tackles? And so maybe you're looking at missed tackles forced or similar metrics to that. But I just consistently see that at the NFL level. These guys who are just plotters who don't make guys miss. They're not elusive whatsoever. And there's multiple ways to be elusive, but if it's not showing up at all on the field, a lot of concerns with that. So, and maybe some of the other metrics that you guys are looking at almost overlap, but I specifically want to see that out of my backs. At least that's one of the boxes I'm checking. So it's not the end all be all, but yeah, like the size, explosiveness, all those things, definitely things that I look at in addition to, like you said, like I haven't really been using reception market share. I think that that's a great one. The PPR points per touch. I think that those are very good ideas. So I appreciate that input.
Yeah, I think once again, you're just trying to get an idea of who the player can be. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be drafted in the best position or anything like that. And unfortunately, that's what it all kind of boils down to. We're just trying to figure out, like, A, are you going to be good if you make it to the NFL? But then more importantly, are you going to make it to the NFL? And then the most important, are you going to end up in a good position, or are you going to get drafted early? And so I really do think when it comes to running backs, that you have to look at some of these teams that just pump out running backs to the NFL. And so whereas earlier I was talking about QBs and wide receivers and how I don't truly care what team they go to, although if you go to Ohio State, as a wide receiver, I might just fall in love with you. But, when you're looking at like an Alabama, a Wisconsin, or, some of these teams that are just literally pumping out quality NFL players, then you kind of have to say, hey, all right, maybe I bumped this guy up a tier, that kind of thing. But, Aaron, I know in the past you've kind of touched on, or at least with maybe not on the pod, but, we've discussed how, certain things that you're looking for, whether it's, recruit ranking and stuff like that. Is there anything that like you truly look for as far as that, like the pedigree, like once again, like the recruits, the stars, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, good question. Definitely look for that. 4 or 5-star guys, they just hit at a higher rate, right? And Travis May's done some great research on that, and he could definitely illustrate that better than I could. But yeah, at the end of the day, it matters to a degree, but similar to I forget exactly what that was earlier in the podcast we were discussing. It's not that they can't hit if they're a lower star by any means. Like once they show that they're really good, I don't care. But yeah, I think that that's a great tool when we don't have many data points on these guys. So incoming freshmen, we have to look at that. We have to look a little bit at situation, so landing spot, and then a little bit of the depth chart. I mean, those things can always change, especially in the era of transfers. So if you see a really weak back who's, maybe he's going to have an opportunity at Bama in 2 years. Well, chances are a big fish is going to come into that pond. That guy might never see the field. So there's a lot of things to weigh. So you can't just rely on situation, right? But it's a good bet to invest in some of these Alabama backs, especially when they are good recruits. And then maybe you are able to look at some of the things like, do they actually make guys miss? Are they explosive? Do they have the size to be feature backs? So I guess those are all things that I take into consideration at the end of the day.
I like it. Is there anything you're looking for, Nelly? When it comes to the running backs beyond the metrics, are you obviously like I said, they're one of the easiest to kind of figure out, but at the same time, it's just playing the game of who's going to get drafted earlier. Think of all the people that thought Isaiah Spiller was going to be, like the first running back off the board, a first round pick, like that kind of thing. And then he gets drafted in the 4th and people are still excited about him, whether they're right or wrong, but you can't be overly excited about a 4th round pick. So how do we what are you looking for to avoid those kind of things?
Well, something you can kind of do is going back to kind of combine stuff. We don't have that information until they do it, but what you do have is there's like tracking technology out there these days that'll kind of tell you how fast people are on the field. You can go back to high school track times and kind of compare, like you can kind of convert those to 40 times and you can kind of get a sense for their athleticism level. And so like you can see, for example, we didn't know that it was Isaiah Spiller was going to run like a 4.6, but we knew he wasn't going to run a 4.4. Like that was already kind of known. We knew that his athleticism was adequate at best. So that's something interesting. I also agree with what you guys say. I think team matters. Like it's a good bet to go get the starting running back at Alabama or Georgia. It just is. They pump out studs at the position. And the NFL likes them, like because they know that they're good players. And so draft capital is kind of more expected. We saw that with someone like Brian Robinson this year, who's probably not like he got drafted because he was a starting running back at Bama. And the other thing is recruiting pedigree. I agree with you there, Aaron, as well. Like that matters. It's a pretty good data point to use, especially when the guys are younger.
I love it. I agree. And, when you're looking at the running backs, you're just trying to figure out who's going to actually get drafted because, As much as I might fall in love with certain players, when it all boils down to it, it really is the draft capital that matters with those positions. Aaron looks like he has a point here, though.
Yeah, no, it's more of a question actually. It's for either of you, but we can go to Nelly first. How much are you scared away by these guys who come from small schools? So I'm thinking Rasheen Ali, Marshall, thinking Lou Nichols, Central Michigan, Dwayne McBride, UAB. Uh, there's other guys in this class, of course, very productive. Maybe they have some things going for them, maybe size, speed, whatever the case is, production, but they're from small schools. We know that there's only going to be so many guys drafted highly by the NFL, and the NFL has shown us, okay, they don't love drafting these guys. I'm not sure exactly what the percentage is of backs that are from small schools who go day one, day two, or end up being like good NFL producers, for example. But I'm just curious if you have looked at that at all, or if you have anything you'd like to say there.
I would like to say I should probably do some kind of study of how often they actually make it to the NFL and become a stud. Obviously, we have times where it's worked out, and these small school guys do work out. So I mean, it's not like it's impossible or anything like that. Once again, just like with the wide receivers and the QBs and any other position, I heavily discount them if they're at a small school. I really try my best to make sure that they don't end up as a good, like a high rank, like that kind of thing. And yet Lou Nichols does. I've talked to Aaron, in DMs about how much I love Lou Nichols, and he was like, "Oh, I don't really quite get it." And then he comes back 2 days later and he said, "Hey, man, I just watched some tape. He's a lot more explosive than I remember him being. He wasn't always looking like that when he was running, and things are looking a lot better." And I'm like, yeah, there's a reason why I say things when I say things, but yeah. So like somebody like Nichols, I honestly I think he has a decent shot. Now, does that mean a 3rd round pick, a 4th round pick? Maybe, but man, I really just love the player. When you get into somebody like Rasheen Ali, I don't think he's quite the same player. Coming from another small conference and everything, but I don't think he's quite the same player. So like if you're just truly comparing the two guys, obviously give me Lou Nichols. But if you're just talking about like drafting them overall, I think that even if you're strictly just talking about like Devy and not even like the campus side of C2C, I still think that they can have value because those guys can end up being like a James Robinson or somebody like that when it's all said and done. That ends up being like a 7th round pick or an undrafted free agent that ends up kind of blowing up because they're good quality players. They just didn't quite get the shot that they should have gotten, most likely.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I agree with everything you said.
There we go. We can shut the whole podcast down. We don't ever have to do anything ever again or talk to anyone else. We just got the best answer that we could possibly ever get. And so we're going to go ahead and shut this thing down. We're right around an hour and a half anyway. No, this was a lot of fun, Nelly. This was great. I didn't even know a little background information. I told the guys that I was really busy today. I didn't even write a show sheet or anything like that. I didn't really know if we were going to be able to get to an hour and a half on just talking nerdy, but here we are. We did it. Hopefully everyone's not asleep. And you stayed awake, especially if you're driving. But it was a lot of fun. Aaron, thank you. Nelly, thank you for coming on, talking nerdy with us. And Nelly, why don't you go ahead and tell us all about who you are, where you're at, and where people can find you, and then we'll go ahead and get out of here.
Sure, yeah. So Twitter is @NellyTix Analytics, a little play on words, and you can find all my work over at the Devy Marketplace, at the Devy Marketplace on Twitter. We have a free Discord where we talk C2C Devy, and we have like trade channels and whatnot. And we also have a pet pictures channel, which is a lot of fun. That's my favorite. But it's a fun community that we're building up, and yeah, it's free, so it doesn't hurt to join.
Absolutely. I appreciate you coming on. Love the show. I'm actually a part of that free Discord, so I don't get on there very often, but I am a part of it. And actually, I guess I should probably jump into the puppy pictures or the pet pictures because I just got a new puppy.
Oh, yes,
recently,
please.
so.
The more the merrier.
My wife surprised me with the puppy. P.S. Women, please, or ladies, please do not surprise your husbands with puppies. Aaron, do you have any other words of wisdom for us before we get out of here?
No, puppies are great. Love it.
All right, let's go ahead and get out of here. Yeah, this is a lot of fun. We're going to be bringing on even more guests. I believe we have another guest for next week. If not, we'll find one. In 2 weeks, we definitely have a confirmed guest. But I believe at this point, I guess Aaron's kind of forced us in. Not even that's a bad thing, but he's kind of pushed us into being a weekly show. So here we are, a weekly Devy show where we started as a monthly show. It's a lot of fun. I'm enjoying it. I love having the guest on. Let's go ahead and get out of here. We're cashing out.